One of the headlining features for the Steam Deck OLED was obviously the OLED screen, which came with an HDR or High Dynamic Range certification, but the problem that I and many other gamers had is that it isn't obvious which games have HDR, and even out of the games that say they have HDR, there are quite a few of them where the implementation is just so bad that even though they have HDR, you wouldn't want to use it because it just doesn't look good. So given that context, here are a few games that not only have HDR, but look damn good in HDR on your Steam Deck OLED. Starting with, in my opinion, the best use and implementation of HDR in any game out there for the Steam Deck OLED, it is Ori and the Will of the Wisps. If you're looking for a game just to experience what true, well-mastered HDR looks like on the Steam Deck OLED screen, this is it. Hands down, full stop, that's all there is to it. Now, you might be looking at this footage and thinking to yourself, it looks good, but it just looks good. There's nothing out of the ordinary. And that's kind of the problem with showcasing HDR these days. The video you're watching on YouTube is in SDR or Standard Dynamic Range, so you're not getting the true HDR experience. The main differences you're going to notice between SDR and HDR are higher dynamic range, better peak brightness, increased displayed contrast ratio, and more accurate color representation. This chart does a good job of visualizing those differences where, as you can tell, HDR just allows more lifelike reproduction of colors and contrast. The easiest spec to notice right off the bat is the increased brightness, where in SDR the Steam Deck OLED can hit a peak of 600 nits, but in HDR it can hit up to 1000 nits. That difference alone is not just noticeable, but it makes a big difference in making games feel more immersive. One game that showcases not only that peak brightness increase, but also the increased color space is No Man's Sky. This game's style choice of bright, punchy, heavily saturated colors is perfect for HDR, and it's actually probably my favorite game to play in HDR on the Steam Deck OLED because of those colors. If you look at the dark night sky and it's spotted by distant stars and galaxies, that's the sort of situation that really makes HDR, especially on this OLED screen, pop. The third game on the list is Deep Rock Galactic. If you haven't heard of it, Deep Rock Galactic is a co-op first-person shooter where you play as a dwarf in a team of dwarves who are sent to go mine resources and defend yourselves against anything and everything that might try and stop you from mining those resources. Because you're in mines almost all the time, it gets dark, and I'm talking like real dark, like 100% black if you don't have a light source, and the sources of light are few and far between. Those conditions make the HDR and OLED screen look straight up beautiful between the inky blacks of the dark cave and the incredibly bright flares and the sparkle of the diamonds that you're going to be mining and making money from. Rockin' stone, baby. Also, because this game is less graphically demanding, you can run it at high settings and 90 FPS pretty easily, which makes it awesome to run on handhelds like the deck. Another game that has solid HDR is Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, this is an older game at this point. Rockstar released it back in 2018, but it still has phenomenal visual quality and honestly, even better overall polish. I actually think it's one of the most polished and detailed games that I've ever played in my life. Period, bar none. It's that good. For me, HDR didn't work straight out of the box. I had to force the game to run in Proton Experimental, then change the display settings to full screen, and then it gave me the HDR option. So if you're having trouble, make sure you've done those two things first. And once HDR is enabled, I thought it looked just okay, until I adjusted the brightness slider and the HDR slider from cinematic to game. That might just be a preference thing, but it made the game look a lot better to me. That being said, I found in bright daylight in some settings, I found HDR could look more washed out than SDR, but at night it looked really good with better shadow detail and point lights looking actually bright and realistic. This one wasn't perfect, but I still found myself preferring HDR on after I had tweaked the settings to my liking, but your mileage may vary. Your mileage won't vary with today's sponsor Ugreen and their Uno lineup. The Ugreen Uno wireless charger 15 watt is a robot charger that can not only charge your phone and AirPods at the same time, but it also has a cute little face that doubles as a charging indicator to tell you when he's charging or when he's not charging. When he's just chilling, he makes this content face, but when he's charging your devices, he makes this face. The adjustable Qi 2 wireless charging allows you to set up the perfect angle for your phone while it's charging, and when the phone charger is flipped up, it reveals a wireless AirPods charger, which is really convenient. And this isn't just a wireless phone charger, it's more of a charging hub. It has a spare USB Type-C port where you can slot an Apple Watch charger and become a fully fledged charging station. If you need a bit more juice, Ugreen has you covered with their Uno 100 watt charger. This happy little guy can put out 100 watts out a single port, which is perfect if you need to top up a laptop or iPhone. Actually, Ugreen's whole Uno lineup are fast and fun accessories for the new iPhone. It'll take an iPhone 15 Pro from 0 to 60% in just 30 minutes. It has 3 Type-C ports and a Type-A port for those of us who still have old Type-A cables. Oh, and did I mention he has little shoes? This is perfect if you're like me and you like to travel with a Steam Deck, battery bank, iPad, Kindle, and you want to be able to top all of them up at the same time. If you're interested in either of these little robots or anything else in Ugreen's newly announced Uno lineup, check out the description below, and thanks again to Ugreen for sponsoring this video. Shadow of War has been one of my new favorite games to play on the deck. It's an older AAA game from 2017, and because of that, you can get between 40 and 60 FPS at high settings on the Steam Deck's native resolution. And at those settings, this game looks amazing. Not only that, but it has HDR built in that worked straight out of the box with no tweaks required. I actually think games like this are where the Steam Deck really shines. Take a AAA game from a few years ago, and the deck can run it at high settings, sometimes even maxed out, and solid frame rates. And because of the deck's relatively small screen, they still visually look fantastic. I actually think older AAA games can look better than newer AAA games on the Steam Deck screen because you can often run them at native res and high settings versus on the newer games, you usually have to run them at low settings and upscale just to get to playable frame rates. Anyway, this game looks and runs fantastic on the Steam Deck, so if you want to slay some orc in HDR, this is the best way to do it. I've put well over 100 hours into Elden Ring on my Steam Deck, and while it's not a perfect playing experience, it's been more than good enough for me to beat the entire game and lots of optionals on this 7-inch screen. If the HDR setting isn't showing up for you on your deck, toggle the display setting from windowed to borderless to full screen, then the option should appear. Elden Ring is a beautiful game, there's no denying that, and while it doesn't have the best implementation of HDR I've ever tested, it is still rock solid. There are some areas that can look a little washed out, especially during daytime, but in dark areas like caves and dungeons, HDR shines. This is another game where after you toggle on HDR, you might want to go into the brightness settings and adjust them according to your preference, and that'll make it look a lot better than stock. This game looks so damn good on the deck. For Batman Arkham Knight, the developers went for a semi-realistic but also clearly stylized look with bolder dark lines, deep shadows, and an overall gritty feel, and it absolutely pops on the Steam Deck OLED. Not only can you easily run the game with all the settings maxed out, but because of the exaggerated blacks, it really shows off the OLED screen, which can turn pixels off so that blacks are actually black, not gray like on an LCD. The texture qualities show that the game is getting older. It came out back in 2015, but especially when you get to the neon lights popping against dark backgrounds, I think it holds up really well. Dragon's Dogma 2 came out a few months ago to a, let's call it a lackluster launch, and a big part of that was that it just did not run well on PCs. I personally couldn't keep a consistent 60 FPS with medium settings on my desktop, which has a 5800X 3D and an RTX 3080. Now, are those the newest specs out there? No, but it is still a very solid gaming setup, and it should be able to run games at medium settings, full stop. Unfortunately, the Steam Deck didn't hold well under that performance review either. With everything set to as low as you can get it, you can get playable frame rates of between 20 and 30, and I would actually play the game like this because it looks pretty solid on a smaller screen, especially with HDR turned on. The highlights and shadows look fantastic, it has great dynamic range, but the problem is there's this weird glitch with the shadows especially on foliage where they pop in and out and it is incredibly distracting. I'm putting this game in the list because it's so close to looking good in HDR, but they just need to fix that shadow clipping in and out, and then it's going to be playable. I'm hoping Capcom can come out with an update and that optimizes the game, because I actually really enjoy the gameplay, but it's just not optimized well enough to run on lower end systems, or honestly even high end systems at this point. And for the last game on this list, the game I've been putting the most time into over these last few months, it's Helldivers 2. I've made several performance videos for Helldivers 2 on the Steam Deck, so if you want a deeper dive, check out any of those videos. The short of it is this: with mostly low and medium settings, you can get between 20 and 30 FPS when the hordes are spawning. And I'm saying when the hordes are spawning because that's when you need the FPS the most, and you can get higher FPS than that when they're not spawning, when there's not a bunch of enemies on screen, but that doesn't really matter. Really, you need to be able to move and aim when there are a lot of enemies on screen. Now, 20 to 30 FPS is not ideal. It is playable, but it's definitely not ideal. You can decide for yourself if that's playable for you or not, but Helldivers does have an easy toggle to turn HDR on and off, and for the most part, it looks really good, especially the explosions. Like when you have a 500 kg bomb go off right next to you in HDR, man, it is something else. It just gets so bright and vivid. And if you've played Helldivers, you know bombs are going off right next to you all the time. That's like a big part of the game, is that you're blowing yourself up by accident and your team is blowing you up by accident for democracy. It does have some weird glitches where sometimes shiny surfaces like metals can come off as way too shiny and they can like blur the whole screen and it looks weird. But for me, toggling HDR off and then toggling it back on fixed it when that did happen, so it doesn't seem like that much of an issue. And if you do have that glitch or glitches like it, you can always just turn HDR off and it still looks good. So those have been my favorite games to play with HDR on the Steam Deck OLED. If you have HDR games that you like playing, please let me know in the comment section below, because I'm trying to create a collection of good HDR games for the Steam Deck OLED, because they just look so good on the screen that I'm purposefully playing games on the Steam Deck OLED that have HDR, because it just looks that much better. It just looks good. So if you have any games that I missed, let me know in the comment section below and I might add them in a future video. Thanks again to Ugreen for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.